Hey everyone, my name is Tim, and this is So You Want Me to Believe. I know I keep saying this, but please stay inside. Seriously, I know people like to underplay the seriousness of things like this, but if you haven't gathered by now, the coronavirus really is something to be worried about. The media got a lot of flack for turning this into a widespread panic, but look around you. Businesses are closed, local and state governments are mandating curfews and closures, and people are dying. I know it's boring, and I know you don't want to, but for the love of God, just please stop leaving your house unless you absolutely have to. This whole thing is just going to keep going and going unless we start actually doing what we're told. Anyway, welcome back to our weekly schedule. The issues I had been having have officially been resolved, and I'm really hoping not to experience any more issues like that in the future. But you got a bonus episode out of it, so that's only extra content for you to enjoy. How did we feel about the bonus episode? Do you guys have any theories about the Kanika Jenkins case you want to share with me? Like I mentioned at the end of that episode, I'm considering doing a part 2 and discussing more theories people have about the case. There are just so many theories out there, and I only covered a handful of them. If you do want to hear part 2, though, you will have to subscribe to the Patreon. Unless I mention otherwise, any future bonus episodes will only be available to my Patreon subscribers. So check out my Patreon page for all the available tiers. The link is in the show notes. Another thing before I really get started here, how do we feel about merch? I've come across an opportunity to have some t-shirts made with a logo printed on them, and maybe some other items. Would there be any interest in purchasing podcast merch? Let me know by sending me an email to sywmtbpod@gmail.com. If you don't already know, Patreon is an online membership platform that provides business tools for creators to run a subscription content service. It allows subscribers or patrons to help creators to continue producing content while offering exclusive rewards and perks for their support. The link to my Patreon page is www.patreon.com/sywmtbpod. There are 3 tiers, each with their own set of incentives. If you'd like to check those out, follow that link to the page and they're listed there for you. If you do like the show, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. Everyone who subscribes not only gets exclusive content, but it goes a long way in helping me produce the show. Any support is greatly appreciated. I also want to plug Buzzsprout. I don't have enough of a listener base to get an actual sponsor, so to be clear, Buzzsprout is not sponsoring this show. But they are a great service that offers content creators affiliate partnerships, so I do want you to know about them. Buzzsprout is a podcast hosting service that allows creators to put the content they make out into the world. If you've ever been interested in starting your own podcast, like I'm doing now, Buzzsprout is an excellent resource to help you achieve that goal. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know I sent you, gets you a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan, and helps support the show. I use Buzzsprout, and it's really helped make putting out the podcast an easy task. Buzzsprout offers a lot of useful and convenient features, like tons of guides to help you find the right equipment at the right price, getting your show listed in every major podcast platform, and by providing a great-looking podcast website that includes audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners. The team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. So join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. For this week's Weird History Fact, I want to talk a little bit about the Black Death. But not like gruesome suffering facts, more about a theory as to how the plague began to spread across Europe. Did you know that many people believe that the Vatican is solely responsible for the widespread outbreak of the Black Death? In the early 1230s, Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull, which is an official order or proclamation issued by the Pope, called Vox in Rama. People believe that this bull declared cats, particularly black cats, as instruments of Satan. This would set medieval Europe on a purge of all cats, killing nearly the entire population of cats all across Europe. Well, as we know, cats are notorious hunters of mice and rats. But if there are no cats to hunt the mice and the rats, what happens to their population? Without the cats, there was a huge boom of rats. Rats that carried fleas, and fleas which carried diseases like the bubonic plague. Today there seems to be some debate about whether or not the plague was spread by flea-infested rats, but rather it's now argued that the spread of the Black Death was from human-to-human contact. And if that's the case, then the amount of cats in the world would have had nothing to do with the spread of disease across Europe. But regardless of that debate, it's likely that the story of a great cat purge is not entirely true. I'm going to read for you a portion of the Papal Bull so that you can understand where this idea comes from. The following rites of this sect are carried out when any novice is to be received among them and enters the sect of the demand for the first time, the shape of a certain frog or toad appears to him. Some kiss this creature on the hindquarters and some on the mouth. They receive the tongue and saliva of the beast inside their mouths. Sometimes it appears unduly large, and sometimes equivalent to a goose or a duck, and sometimes it even assumes the size of an oven. At length, when the novice has come forward, he is met by a man of wondrous pallor who has black eyes and is so emaciated and thin that since his flesh has been wasted, seems to have remaining only skin drawn over bone. The novice kisses him and feels cold, like ice, and after the kiss the memory of the Catholic faith totally disappears from his heart. Afterwards, they sit down to a meal, and when they have arisen from it, the certain statue, which is usual in a set of this kind, a black cat descends backwards with its tail erect. First the novice, then the master, then each one of the order who are worthy and perfect, kiss the cat on its buttocks. Then each returns to his place, and speaking certain responses, they incline their heads towards the cat. "Forgive us," says the master, and the one next to him repeats this, a third responding, "We know, master," a fourth says, "And we must obey." If we take that portion of text for what it is likely that the Pope was condemning a ritual act involving cats for some kind of perceived satanic cult. The last bit I read for you does mention cats, and it is referring to them in a way that implies use for a ritual of some sort, so it's easy to see where this misinterpretation comes from, and how a false story about history can spread. However, even if we do assume that the Pope wanted to rid the earth of all cats, the bubonic plague began spreading across Europe in 1347, about 120 years after Pope Gregory IX issued his papal bull. It is possible that even then, Europeans misinterpreted what the Pope was saying in his decree, and through the years, the popularity of the cats as puppets for Satan theory became more widespread, ultimately leading to the outbreak of one of the deadliest plagues in human history. But there doesn't seem to be any real historical evidence to back that up, so it's very unlikely that that's the case. Still though, it's a pretty interesting theory, and many people still believe it to this day. Speaking of things that may or may not be true, I want to talk a little bit about a story that I first heard when I attended college in 2009. This might make for a little shorter of an episode, but I really wanted to talk about this one for my first dedicated paranormal story. It's a story specific to my alma mater, Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois, but it's one of the most popular ghost stories in Illinois. I loved talking about this when I was in school, and oftentimes when I visited my friends who lived in Pemberton Hall, we would try to scare ourselves into believing we were witnessing acts of the ghost. So, this is the story of Mary Hawkins, the ghost that haunts the women's dorm of Pemberton Hall. A lot of the information I gathered for this week's episode came from an article written by Michael Clean in 2014 titled The Legend of Pemberton Hall. If you're interested in reading the article, I'll have a link posted to it in the show notes. EIU also has a few other publications hosted on their website in regards to the specific story if you're interested in reading more. But before I go too much into the actual ghost story, I want to talk a little bit about Pemberton Hall itself. As I mentioned, Pemberton Hall is an all-female dormitory located at the northwest corner of the Eastern Illinois University campus. Built in 1908, Pemberton Hall would become the first college building in the state of Illinois to provide housing for women on campus. The man responsible for the creation of the dorm was Livingston C. Lord, who was president of the school from 1899 to 1933. Then called Eastern Illinois State Normal School, Lord wanted to expand the campus and allow for an all-female dorm to be available for its students. He brought his idea in front of the Appropriations Committee of the Illinois State Legislature, who essentially just laughed off the idea, telling Lord he, quote, had made a fairly good joke. But there was one senator who saw potential in Lord's idea, took it seriously, and began to lobby on Lord's behalf. That senator's name was Stanton C. Pemberton. So with the help of Senator Pemberton, Lord was able to receive $100,000 from the Illinois legislature to build the dorm in an accompanying gymnasium, and then were given an additional $3,000 to finish the basement and the attic of the building. The senator must have been a pretty persuasive man to go from literally laughing at the idea of an all-female dorm to getting the state to invest over $100,000 in the project. And because he was so instrumental in the creation of the hall, the building was named for him and still bears his name today. Pemberton Hall would officially open its doors on January 4th, 1909, and became campus housing for about 100 women, led by the first headmistress of the building, Miss Estelle Gross. However, Miss Gross would only stay on board at Pemberton Hall for about a year, at which time she was succeeded by a woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Hawkins. Mary Hawkins was born in Moat, England on September 10, 1877. I unfortunately could not find much information about Moat, England, but I assume it's a relatively small, normal town. In 1901, Mary would emigrate from England to the United States at the age of 24. We don't know a whole lot about Mary's life from the time she came to America until the time she came to the school, but she would become the dorm director for Pemberton Hall in 1910 at the age of 33. Mary was a very strict woman, which was not unusual for authority figures of the time. She insisted that the girls have a curfew of 7:30 p.m. on the dot and lights out no later than 10:30 p.m. And there was almost nowhere the girls under her watch could go without supervision, the exceptions being class and church services. However, it wasn't a prison. The girls were allowed to go home for the weekends and could even entertain guests until 10 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays. It's pretty crazy to think about the strict rules students had to follow back in those days. I mean, there is no curfew for the students now. They're treated like adults for the most part. When I was in school, they did kick opposite-sex visitors out of dorms at a certain time of night, but I believe since I've graduated, a number of those dorms have become co-ed. Times have really changed over the last 100 years. So Mary Hawkins was a successful dorm director who cared deeply for the students under her care. She would continue in this role for 16 years until her mental health started to deteriorate and she would be forced to step down. She left the school in 1917. In 1918, Mary would be admitted to the M.A. Montgomery Memorial Sanitarium, also located in Charleston. This was a pretty small building, only housing about 30 patients at a time. Again, there's not a lot of information out there about the sanitarium. If I still had access to all the records available to students at EIU, I might have been able to find out some more information on the building. But with just Google at my current disposal, the best I can guess is that the building still stands, but is now known as the Our House and is used as a rehabilitation center for those suffering from drug and alcohol dependence. Her doctors would describe Mary as depressed and irrational, stating that she suffered from delusions of persecution, hallucinations, insomnia, and memory loss. At the time, the doctors believed that Mary was just overworked and overstressed, which led to a mental breakdown. Medicine wasn't very developed back then, obviously, but I think there may have been some gender stereotypes at play in that determination as well. Just as the senators laughed off the idea of an all-female dormitory, I assume the doctors were probably of the belief that women were not suited for work outside the home, and that Mary was just the prime example of why that would be. In reality, Mary's condition was probably the result of disease. On October 30th, 1918, Mary would finally succumb to her illness. She died in her hospital bed in Kankakee, Illinois, and was buried in the Mound Cemetery back in Charleston. On Mary's death certificate, it stated that she suffered from general paralysis of the insane, otherwise known as general paresis. Today, we recognize this as a development of late-stage syphilis. It's unconfirmed if this was actually the disease that ultimately took Mary from the world, but the popular belief is that she had contracted syphilis approximately a decade before her death and that it had gone untreated. Her actual obituary ran in the Charleston Daily Courier in 1918, and it reads, Mary E. Hawkins, born in England in 1877, died at Kankakee, Illinois, October 30, 1918, was at the head of Pemberton Hall from August 1910 until March 1917. She was a woman of education and refinement and a most efficient person in the position she occupied. Very seldom indeed does one find in the same individual good business ability, a most excellent housekeeper, and a fine influence over young women. Her counsel and advice were sought by those organizing work similar to hers, and her work was highly esteemed by all who knew it. Her death is sincerely mourned by all those who knew her. So how does Mary's death, in a different town completely than the building she supposedly haunts, lead to any sort of ghost story? Well, let's talk a little bit about the legend and some of the encounters people have described with the spirit of Pemberton Hall. It all started on a cold winter's night sometime in the early 1900s. The exact year is unknown and up for debate, but it was supposedly in the first few years of Mary's residency as a dorm director. It was winter break, and all but one student had gone home to be with their family. The name of the student is also not known, but we do know that the dorm had only 3 occupants on this night in particular: Mary, the lone student, and a janitor. After a long night of studying, this unnamed co-ed grew bored of her books. The story I had always heard was that the student was a music major and had a fondness for the sound of piano. So, tired of her studies, she went up to the 4th floor of Pemberton Hall to play a little piano. As she sits down and begins to play a little tune, she begins to get lost in the music, completely unaware of her surroundings. It was at this moment that the janitor could hear the music coming from the 4th floor. Again, not much is known about this janitor except that he was a dirty old man who was hired from the local poor farm to clean the newly built dormitory. Enticed by the sweet melody drifting down from the top floor, the janitor finds himself following the music. He reaches the 4th floor, where he sees a young, beautiful girl in a nightgown hitting the keys of the piano, creating an intoxicating string of notes. Unable to control himself, he sneaks up behind the girl, who still has not noticed his presence. He then grabs the girl, pulling her to the ground, and begins mercilessly beating and raping her. He rips at her nightgown while she struggles to break free of his grasp. He continues to beat her until he believes she is no longer breathing and then escapes into the night. However, the girl was not quite dead. With what little she had left in her, she dragged herself down the stairs and in front of Mary's room, where she would scratch at the door, trying her best to get the dorm director's attention. But alas, Mary was sound asleep, and the girl's weakened body could not muster up enough strength to make a sound that would awaken her. The following morning, Mary would get out of bed like any other normal day. But when she opened her door, she would see the girl's bloody, lifeless body laying in the hallway, her fingernails still embedded in the wood outside her door. The 4th floor of Pemberton Hall has been sealed shut since that night. Plagued with the guilt and fearing the safety of the rest of the students upon the return from vacation, Mary would drive herself insane and ultimately died in a mental institution. It's said that her ghost, and possibly the ghost of the unnamed murdered co-ed, still roam the halls of Pemberton. The girl still trying to get the attention of someone to help her, and Mary still lingering in an attempt to protect all girls who reside in the dormitory. Many of the residents of Pemberton Hall, to this day, claim to see and hear evidence that someone is still haunting the dorm. The reports consist of several different variations, from strange and unexplained noises, to seeing mysterious footprints in various places throughout the building, or even seeing apparitions of spirits wandering the 4th floor. There are several written reports of hauntings throughout the 70s and 80s, and even through to the early 2000s. One report from an unknown woman in 1976 said she often saw lights coming from the 4th floor of Pemberton Hall, where no one is allowed to enter. And a resident advisor at Pemberton would report she would often find lounge furniture being rearranged by itself. And when she would ask someone to come help her reorganize the area, they would come back to the room in perfect order. Some girls also reported a strange encounter with a girl in a white nightgown going around asking everyone for safety pins before completely disappearing. In 1984, a woman by the name of Patty O'Neill was working as a reporter for the Herald and Review, a local newspaper for the town of Decatur, which is another town in central Illinois. In her own words, Patty described her experience with the apparition by saying, "I was in a very light sleep when I got an awful feeling that someone was watching me. As I turned over to look, I glanced at the lighted digital number on the clock, and it was 2:15 a.m. I saw a figure standing by the side of my bed, dressed in something like a nightgown or a robe. She stood there for several seconds, then turned and walked toward the door. She opened the door and started to leave when she turned around with one hand on the door and looked back at me for several more seconds. She left, closing the door behind her." In other reports, people would describe small black footprints as if someone was tiptoeing around that would lead from the door to the closet and then back to the door. And along that idea, people would often report clothes missing from their closets, only to find them strewn around in the hallway hours later. The clothes most often reported missing were undergarments and revealing sleepwear. Some believe this is the ghost of Mary Hawkins reprimanding the girls for wearing unladylike clothing. But the reports that convince most that the ghost is in fact Mary Hawkins involve doors that have been left unlocked before going to bed being found locked the following morning, or electronic devices like TVs and radios that had been left on at night being found turned off the following morning. Many believe this is evidence that Mary is still roaming the halls and watching over the girls of Pemberton Hall. Most of these reports seem to involve just that, Mary Hawkins looking out for the women of the building. but there are other reports that seem to suggest otherwise. Several people throughout the years have reported being able to hear scratching at their doors as if the murdered girl were still trying to get someone's attention. And on top of that, other people have reported hearing thuds and loud dragging noises coming from the 4th floor as if someone were being attacked. People have also described times where they could hear knocking on doors accompanied by strange noises in the hallway, only to find the hallway to be absent upon investigation. Others have also reported banging on walls, footsteps both in the hallway and coming from the abandoned 4th floor, a soft sound of piano playing off in the distance, and disembodied whispers. In the book Haunted Illinois, the author describes an experience his wife encountered during her time at EIU. She says that she and some of the other women in the dorm were showering in the communal showers on their floor. When they finished, they all distinctly remember closing the curtains of all the individual shower stalls in the room. When they left the room, closed the door, and entered the hallway, they could hear a loud sound like something monstrous was sliding across the floor. When they went back in to investigate, they saw all the shower curtains had been opened and a large wooden chair had somehow moved all the way across the room and was now sitting directly in front of the door. Now, obviously, just like any other paranormal theory, the validity of this story is under debate. Many professors and employees of the university reject the idea that any building on campus is haunted and give their own reasons as to why. In 2012, the Daily Eastern News put out a video in which they interviewed the director of University Housing and Dining Services, Mark Hudson. In this interview, Mr. Hudson takes the student reporters onto the 4th floor and shows what remains up there. According to him, the 4th floor was most likely used as staff quarters for housekeepers, cooks, and other staff. You know, like janitors. It also used to be an infirmary for students who had fallen ill. However, the majority of the 4th floor is unfinished, and Mr. Hudson believes that's why the 4th floor has been closed off. The floor isn't completely sturdy, a lot of the walls aren't finished in certain spaces, and it was built as an attic. It was never intended for students to live there. Mr. Hudson also says that the ghost stories told about Pemberton Hall are just that, stories. There is no actual record of anyone being murdered in the building, and he doesn't believe anyone has died there. In another interview posted by EIU students in 2012, one of the history professors on staff, Dr. Terry Barnhart, agrees with Mr. Hudson's assertions. He says none of the facts of the story seem to line up with a real-life timeline of events, although he admits that names and facts could have been confused over the years, and none of this means that the story didn't happen. However, Dr. Barnhart believes that the story originated as a scary story to be told at Halloween celebrations, which used to be a really big thing back in the day. He says there are pictures of some of these celebrations in the archives at the university's library, and they show one of those pictures in the video. The picture shows a large group of female students, all dressed to the nines in varying witch costumes. The whole room looks to be decorated extravagantly, and it really looks like it was a big deal to the students of the time. Dr. Barnhart explains that Halloween was a huge tradition, specifically for Pemberton Hall, and suspects that these celebrations probably birthed the story of Mary Hawkins and the girl playing the piano. But is that all just too convenient of an explanation? According to Mr. Hudson, the 4th floor was never intended to be a space for living quarters, but it seemed to be just fine for the staff. Also, you can clearly see an old, rotting piano sitting on the 4th floor of the building in the video. And Dr. Barnhart even admits that the story could have actually happened. In fact, some people speculate that there was some kind of big cover-up, and the reason no one can find any information about the events of that night is because it went completely unreported. This murder supposedly took place right as World War I was beginning and rationing was in effect, and because of that, the school newspaper would only print editions sporadically. A lot of people believe that this was just a convenient excuse not to report a brutal murder on the campus, and that Mary Hawkins and the unnamed co-ed still roam the halls of Pemberton Hall today. So what do you think? Do you think there's any validity to this story? Is Mary Hawkins still trying to protect the girls of Pemberton Hall? And is the unnamed co-ed still desperately pleading for her life by trying to get the attention of someone in their room? Or do you agree with the staff that the whole thing is just a hoax, albeit a fun tradition for students to continue? Let me know what you think by sending me an email to sywmtbpod@gmail.com. Once again, if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to check out my Patreon page. The link is in the show notes. And don't forget to follow me on social media. You can like me on Facebook. My page is titled So You Want Me to Believe Podcast. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is @sywmtbpod on both platforms. If you did like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Good ratings and reviews help others find the show, and they just make me feel good about myself. And if you didn't like the show, I'm sorry your life is so miserable. Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I will see you all again next week.